Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The War of Attrition Hezbollah wages on Israel since last year's October 8 has suddenly been transformed in mid-September into an intensive IDF counterattack across several sectors of Lebanon, from the Shiite terror group's headquarters in Beirut to its offensive infrastructure across from the Upper Galilee. But the military campaign is supposed to advance political goals, which in the Lebanese context have a linkage between removing the threat to Israel to allow displaced Israeli residents to return to their deserted communities and to diminish Iran's grip over Lebanon. In order to analyze Israel's strategic objectives for its northern front, we're joined all the way from the north by Major General in Reserve Gershon Ha-Cohen, formerly the commander of the Israeli Defense Forces, Defense Colleges, as well as an Army Corps commander on both the northern front as well as the General Staff. It's always a pleasure to see you, General.
Good to be with you.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yaron Rosen, formerly the IDF Chief of Cyber Staff, as well as an Israeli Air Force commander and a fighter pilot. It's always a pleasure to see you, General.
Pleasure to be here, Jonathan.
It's good to have you with me in the studio. TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what are the strategic objectives of Jerusalem for the northern front, which is currently, of course, in a state of high intensity?
So while in Gaza, one of Israel's objectives is to destroy Hamas as a military and governmental power, in the north, Israel does not have such an ambition. It knows that it is improbable to achieve it in the time allotted. It wants to degrade from Hezbollah's power in Lebanon in general, in order, among other achievements, to have a Lebanese president installed after 2 years without one. And as you mentioned, to have the entire strip or rectangle between the Mediterranean and the northernmost Israeli town of Metula cleared of both Hezbollah's arsenal and infrastructure, and push the Hezbollah forces north of the Litani River in order to have the Israeli residents feel secure enough to come back, because the government obviously cannot order them to come back as long as they fear that Hezbollah could not only rocket them, as he does many other places in Israel, but also raid and massacre the way Hamas did.
Indeed. Well, General Ha-Cohen, I'd like to just ask plainly, what is Israel's strategic goal for the current campaign on the northern front, knowing that it is, of course, one of many various fronts, and therefore, is there a strategic objective for Lebanon proper?
No, it was defined quite well with just declaring that the whole goal is to bring back the residents in security conditions to their home. The main problem is what will be considered as security conditions. Meanwhile, the operation that going ahead now, it is a kind of campaign directed to the villages along the border, is absolutely successful to take the assets and properties of Hezbollah that have been well prepared to afford them surprise attack against Israel. But this is not enough in order to create the necessary security conditions, because this will not prevent all kinds of fire capabilities to the villages along the border, and including Haifa and Tel Aviv. It means that the General Staff is quite aware that this operation in itself, not at all beginning to deliver the conditions in order to bring the whole goal of that operation. It means will not be enough in order to call the residents to come back to their home, and yet it will not be enough in order to save Haifa and even Tel Aviv from rockets every day that are repeated again and again every day. Therefore, the door is open to a kind of agreement. And the main question is whether at all Israel will succeed, together with the United States and Amos Hochstein, to create conditions that will be accepted in Israel and will make the conditions that people will really feel safe to come back to their home. This is now the main question, because if we are not going to a kind of order, then it will be really demanded another operation, because this operation now, as long as it is successful, will really come to a kind of culmination point in which a new operation will be demanded. This is the question. A new campaign or operation, another one, or a process for getting an agreement.
Indeed. General Rosen, your take on this? Obviously, a sense of security is more complicated than actual security.
Yeah, I think we need to pay attention to two things. Lebanon as a country that is a neighbor, our northern neighbor, and has direct implications. Its stability, its future has implications on Israel's future, as we have seen in the last few decades. The second thing is Lebanon as an arm of Iran. These are the two things that will, in the long term, define the future of how we deal with neighboring country, our neighboring country from the north. And I think that in that sense, what Gershon mentioned is very important to pay attention to a few details. First of all, 1559, the UN resolutions 1559 and 1701, both had a declaration of disarmament of armed militias. Well, that did not work very well. The 1559 is from 2004 and was aimed mainly towards Syrian occupation, but any armed militia. And 1701, after the Second Lebanon War, was aimed at Hezbollah, to disarm Hezbollah. Both of them are not working. So, you ask yourself, what should work? So the only thing that will work is completely changing the internal balance of militias in Lebanon. So where we are now is maybe there is a window for change for Lebanon, because Israel's attack on Hezbollah in the last month or so has completely changed Hezbollah's reign of terror on Lebanon and towards Israel as well. So I think that in the next few weeks, while Israel continues to build a de facto DMZ in the south, I think that what we need to pay attention is how we take care of the long term and not only the near term. Now, there are conflicting interests here because the US election is pushing Amos Hochstein with all the good intentions. It may not work in the next 2 weeks. And I think that it might be even counterproductive that it will work in the next 2 weeks, because we really have to change the dynamics, the internal dynamics, and we're seeing the diplomatic implications, the internal political implications. New forces are suddenly speaking internally in Lebanon. That is very, very encouraging, but it takes time for people to understand and to gain courage and all these things. So I think that the practicalities of defense is one thing, the South, a DMZ, and a long-term implication of disarming armed militias in Lebanon. That's one thing. And the second thing is the stability, the long-term stability of Lebanon as a sovereign nation and its disconnect from Iran.
I think there are 2 points, though, that need to be taken heed of. The first one, while it's obviously very important, whoever is going to win the election, be it Trump or Harris, on November 5th, nevertheless, President Biden will stay in office until January 20th, giving him at least a couple of months to do whatever he deems fit. And of course, the winner of the election will ultimately also drive him to act differently in both scenarios. The second point that I think is very important to note is that the implications of what may occur in Iran may also have significant implications for Lebanon. And therefore, Mr. Oren, are we to draw, General Rosen mentioned, of course, the Lebanon as an arm of Iran, namely Hezbollah as a proxy. Is there going to be an intensification somewhat of the various activities which the Iranians will try to somehow enforce their influence in one way or another?
Yes, but this may not necessarily be the overriding factor. You know, here in Israel, the police or the government in general has tried for many years to disarm the Arab population. There are many civilians here who belong to the Arab community who keep their own arms. Sometimes they smuggle it, sometimes they buy it clandestinely. It's futile because in the Arab tradition, if you don't have your arms, your family is not protected, and who knows what will happen.
They believe in the Second Amendment more than
Yes.
at least half of Americans.
That's true. Now, take it to Lebanon. The idea that you can completely disarm the Shiite militia is hopeless. What you can demand is to take their missiles, their rockets. They have nothing to do with the internal balance in Lebanon. If they want to protect themselves from the Sunnis, from the Maronites or whoever, their light arms will do. But you can insist on taking down their entire missile arsenal, their drones, whatever is of use only against Israel. There is no other role in Lebanon for such offensive weapons, which really belong in a national army, not in one group, one militia. And this, along with stopping the flow of arms from Iran, can be a productive path to an arrangement.
Indeed. Well, with that being said, General Ha-Cohen, I'd like to hear your take on this. Since when Amos Hochstein visited Beirut earlier this week, he highlighted a couple of points that I must say I do agree with. The first and foremost is that UN Security Council Resolution 1701 was fine, but it wasn't enforced by any side. And therefore, when we're talking about UN Security Council Resolution 1701, the mandate granted to the International Peacekeeping Force, which was supposed to be interim to bolster the Lebanese state, namely the Lebanese armed forces and the government there, failed. They failed miserably. They allowed Iran to take over by their local proxy, Hezbollah, not only entrench militarily, but suppress the sectarian structure that brought about the equilibrium following the civil war in Lebanon, that brought about the strife upon the Lebanese public that nobody wants to see reinvigorated. How can you operate in such a explosive environment when you know that diminishing the power of Hezbollah to the point of no return will undoubtedly reinvigorate the sectarian strife between the Shiites, the Sunnah, the Druze, the Christians, be they the Maronites or the other sects within there?
Actually, first of all, I must emphasize that I agree with what was explained by Amir. Secondly, what you're asking me we must realize that Lebanese order is a kind of ecosystem equilibrium. This equilibrium was absolutely went out of stability due to the massive power of Hezbollah. The main question now is whether at all United States and France could bring back what was known as the last equilibrium between all these citizens of Lebanon, the Maronites, the Druze, the Shia, the Sunni. All of them together are now in realization that there is a chance for a new equilibrium. And the main interest of Iran is to create a kind of agreement and ceasefire without bringing a reduction of the hegemony of Hezbollah power. This is the main question. And regarding the implications to Israel, the main question is whether at all an agreement will succeed to create a kind of reduction accepted and implemented by United States and others to prevent Hezbollah from re-equipment, because immediately Iran can re-equip Hezbollah with a lot of new weapons. And again, we are coming to back to square one, back to the 7th, 8th of October. This exactly is the main question from the Israeli point of view, whether the new order in Lebanon will create a change in the whole stream of smuggled weapons to enforce Hezbollah again and again.
Well, Israel, of course, utilized several years following the Second Lebanon War, the Mabam, the campaign between the wars, which was supposed to try and prevent particularly the precision-guided munitions from entering into the Lebanese sphere. Unfortunately, that, albeit somewhat successful, it did not stop the mass flood of weaponry into that country, and therefore we find ourselves in the situation that we are today. General Rosen, your take on that?
I think going to what you just mentioned, the biggest mistake Israel made in the last decade and a half, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, is letting these militias conduct a huge infrastructure and munitions and military buildup. Both of them, Hamas and Hezbollah, amassed a huge arsenal of military power, namely the missile array, and the fact that Israel allowed this to build up, like boiling the frog, like more and more and more, until we woke up and we had one military with a formidable missile array in the south and another one with a huge, unimaginable missile array in the north, is one of the biggest mistakes that Israel made. I think that part of it is wishful thinking. Another part of it is getting hooked on defense, on our active defense. We've been mentioning and talking about this from a strategic standpoint, maybe even psychological standpoint. The fact that Israel has the active defense, the Iron Dome and David Sling and all these defensive measures has allowed both Israel and its enemies to shoot at it, and we accepted the fact that our enemies have the capability to amass these huge missile arrays. And I think moving forward, this is the big change. So first of all, two things may not exist in the future, and I think that is what is most important for the future of the whatever strategy Israel aims at. The two foundations of the future strategy need to be A, no missile array is held by no militia, armed militia in the region. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that Israel does not let a direct threat on its border build up to a sense that the security of our villages and kibbutzim and all of our periphery is threatened from direct invasion in a way that we experienced on October 7th last year. This is the main thing that we have to prevent, and preventing each one of these is a different defensive national security requirement, and it requires a very, very strict strategy, and it requires perseverance, and it requires our friends, namely the United States, to be very supportive of Israel's defense needs. And I think this is what we need to see in the near future, whatever administration we have in the US, and of course the French, which have not shown a lot of support in the last few weeks, even less than support.
Indeed. Well, it's staggering, but Israel was subject to roughly 30,000 rockets, missiles, and other types of munitions being launched at it over the course of the past year from Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and other terror actors in the region. This cannot be in any circumstance, but within international legitimacy, you cannot just stand up and utilize strong power whenever you will it. There are various aspects to this that are required in order to receive or establish the legitimacy to utilize the strong power tool. And within current context, Israel needs to remind the international community at large, and the United States in particular, that it is an asset to the West, something that was somewhat lost in certain holes of power throughout Western civilization that are experiencing the hardships that they themselves didn't expect to experience in recent months.
Well, I'm not sure that governments or foreign ministries really need to be reminded of the facts. They know them full well. They make their decisions because of domestic politics, and also because they don't want to see the failed state of Lebanon disintegrate completely. Who knows what will follow, refugees, migration, and other problems. But there is a need for creative strategy in order to try the wedge between Iran and Hezbollah. We always use the metaphor of either the octopus with the tentacles, or we call on Iran's proxies its arms. If that's the case, we should convince Iran that it is better for it to have one arm cut off, surgically, if you will, because if not, it will poison the blood for Iran. So Iran should be made to understand that it is in its self-interest, if it has its back to the wall, to give up on Hezbollah.
Very biblical of you, Mr. Owen, and
Thank
more
you very
so,
much.
I think that it is a necessity for Iran, albeit Iran itself is not Iran, but the Islamic regime, the Ayatollah regime, is the poison in this context to all nations of the region. But we don't have very much time left. Briefly, General Ha-Cohen, we'll start with you. What are we to expect in the near future from a strategic landscape?
We're expecting to find a way out of that war with a kind of dignity, not in a way that would be told that it is a form of surrender. It is not easy to really take that route and to promise that we will find a way out with dignity from that war, mainly due to the policy of United States, as the Kamala Harris said again and again, and even President Biden said that they are just trying to prevent the region from escalation. And Israel is not considered by them as the one who retaliated by necessity against an existential threat, but as one of these partners or agents in the region that are always finding new justification for escalation. It means that we are really struggling now from the days coming that we will have legitimation to prevent smuggling of new weapons to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, and yet not to be accused by those who are responsible for escalation.
General Rosen, you have 30 seconds, even less. Go ahead.
Yeah, the main factors in the near term are, first of all, Israel's retaliation in Iran. That's the first thing that's going to happen. Then the U.S. elections, I'm betting the first one is going to be before the second one. And the rest of the issues we've discussed, ending the war in Gaza, the hostages, and creating the terms, laying the foundations for a new Lebanon in the future.
General Rosen, General Ha-Cohen, Mr. Owen, thank you so very much for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at TV7israelnews.com.